Imagine this. Blood on the linoleum floor. Bone grinding against bone. When Harper's boyfriend snapped her lower leg bone, her first thought was to survive. Through a haze of sharp pain, she grabbed her phone, typing a desperate message to her sister. "He broke my leg. Mike, please help me." She hit send, praying for help. But the phone vibrated with a reply from an unknown number. 3 words that stopped the breath in her throat. "Give me his name and your address." If you are enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more. The linoleum floor was freezing against Harper's cheek. It smelled of cheap lemon cleaner and old grease. She didn't move. Moving meant feeling the fire burning through her right leg just below the knee. The angle was wrong. It was a terrible unnatural shape that made her stomach turn. The front door slammed, shaking the cheap apartment walls and sending a fresh wave of pain up her thigh. Tyler was gone. He always left after it got this bad. He called it giving her space to cool down, a twisted way of saying her bleeding on the floor was somehow her fault. Harper dragged in a breath. It caught on a sob she refused to let out. She needed her phone. It was on the coffee table 3 feet away. 3 feet might as well have been 3 miles. She gritted her teeth, tasting blood, and dug her elbows into the floor. She dragged her upper body forward. Her right leg trailed behind her like dead weight. The friction of her jeans against the floor sent a sharp wave of sickness straight to her brain. Her vision narrowed, the edges turning a fuzzy gray. "Don't pass out." "Not yet." Her hand slapped against the wood of the coffee table. Her fingers searched for the phone, knocking over a half-empty beer bottle. It shattered. She didn't care. She pulled the phone down to the floor. Her hands shook hard. The rush was leaving her system, replaced by cold crushing shock. She opened her messages. Her vision was swimming, the letters blurring together. She needed her sister, Suddy. Suddy lived 20 minutes away. Suddy had a car. Harper's thumb smeared blood across the screen as she typed a number from memory. She was too panicked to search her contacts. Just the area code and the 7 digits she had dialed 1,000 times. "He broke my leg. Please help me." She hit send. The blue bubble appeared. Harper let her head drop back to the floor, panting. Her chest heaved. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. She watched the screen. Delivered. Seconds ticked by. The pain in her leg was changing from a sharp shock into a deep throbbing ache that matched her pulse. She waited for the 3 gray dots. Suddy was always on her phone. She would reply instantly. She would call. 1 minute, 2. The phone vibrated. Harper snatched it up, squinting at the screen. The reply wasn't from Suddy. There was no contact name, just a string of digits. Harper stared at the top of the screen. She had swapped the last 2 numbers. She read the text. Unknown. Who is this? Panic clawed at her throat. She had texted a stranger. She was bleeding, broken on the floor, and Tyler would be back within the hour. Tyler always came back. He would bring a bag of frozen peas, cry, and tell her how she pushed him too far. If she was still on the floor when he returned, he would realize she was actually hurt. He would panic. And when Tyler panicked, things got worse. Harper's fingers flew across the keyboard, clumsy and frantic. "Harper, I'm sorry. Wrong number." She moved to delete the thread to try Suddy again. The phone buzzed in her hand before she could. Unknown. You said someone broke your leg. Harper, it's a mistake. Please ignore. Unknown. Are you safe right now? Harper stared at the glaring white text. A choking laugh bubbled up in her throat. Was she safe? She was lying in a puddle of spilled beer and her own blood, nursing a snapped lower leg bone, waiting for her abuser to return. Harper, no. She didn't know why she typed it. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was the deep lonely feeling of the apartment. She was so tired of lying. The 3 gray dots appeared right away. They vanished. Appeared again. Then a single message came through. Unknown. Give me his name and your address. Harper froze. The tone of the text wasn't worried. It wasn't a 911 person trying to calm a victim. It read like a demand. Cold, clear. Harper, who are you? Unknown. Someone who hates a bully. The address. Now. A shadow passed over the apartment window. Tyler. He was pacing outside the building. He wasn't leaving. He was working up the nerve to come back upstairs. Harper's breath hitched. She looked at the door, then back at her phone. If she called the police, Tyler would hear the sirens. He would kill her before they made it up the stairs. She had nothing left to lose. Her fingers trembled as she typed her address. Harper Apt W. His name is Tyler. The phone went dark. No reply. Harper lay her head down on her arms, squeezing her eyes shut. The pain was unbearable now. She was an idiot. She had given her address to a complete stranger. It was probably a teenager playing a prank or some creep who got off on the drama. Nobody was coming. She was entirely alone. Then she heard the heavy rhythmic thud of Tyler's boots coming up the stairwell. The doorknob rattled. Harper held her breath, pressing herself as flat against the floor as possible. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a dull thwack. Tyler stepped inside. He was a broad man, wearing a faded mechanic shirt, his knuckles bruised red from where they had connected with her jaw before he kicked her legs out from under her. He held a plastic bag from the convenience store across the street. He looked down at her. His face crumpled into a mask of fake guilt. Harper babe, he murmured, stepping over the shattered beer bottle. Why are you still on the floor? Come on, get up. I can't, she whispered. Her voice was empty of emotion. Tyler sighed, a sharp sound of irritation breaking through the fake sorrow. Don't be dramatic. I barely clipped you. Look, I brought ice. He tossed the bag of ice onto the sofa. Get up. You're getting blood on the rug. My leg is broken, Tyler. He stopped. His eyes darted to her right leg, noting the unnatural bend beneath the denim. The color drained from his face, replaced instantly by panic. And then, as she knew it would, the panic hardened into rage. You're lying. He snapped, taking a step toward her. You just want to make me look like the bad guy. You pushed me, Harper. You were screaming at me. What was I supposed to do? He reached down, grabbing her by the upper arm, and yanked upward. Harper screamed. It tore from her throat, a roar, wild sound that echoed off the thin walls. The pain in her leg flared so brightly she saw sparks behind her eyes. Shut up. Tyler hissed, dropping her arm. He looked frantically toward the door. Shut the hell up. The neighbors will hear. Before Harper could catch her breath, 3 sharp knocks sounded at the door. Tyler froze. He looked at the door, then down at Harper. Did you call the cops? He whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden violent intensity. No. Harper gasped, clutching her leg. No, I swear. The knock came again. Not frantic, not police, just a measured heavy sound. Stay quiet, Tyler ordered, pointing a trembling finger at her. He walked to the door, peering through the peephole. He frowned, pulling back. He hesitated, then unlatched the chain and opened the door a fraction of an inch. Yeah. What do you? The door exploded inward. Tyler was thrown backward, crashing into the drywall. The wood of the door splintered as a massive man in a dark suit stepped through. He moved with terrifying speed, grabbing Tyler by the throat and slamming him against the wall, lifting him completely off his feet. Tyler choked, his legs kicking wildly in the air. The man holding him didn't say a word. He just pinned Tyler there, completely unbothered by the frantic thrashing. Then a second man walked into the apartment. Harper's breath caught. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than she made in a year. His shoes made no sound on the cheap laminate floor. He had dark hair, a sharp jawline, and eyes that were completely chillingly empty. He surveyed the apartment with mild distaste, like he had stepped into something unpleasant on the sidewalk. His gaze drifted to the blood, the shattered glass, and finally to Harper on the floor. He didn't rush to her. He didn't gasp or offer soothing words. He just walked over, his hands resting in his pockets, and looked down at her bent leg. "Harper," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, smooth tone that somehow cut through the ringing in her ears. "Who?" Harper swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "Gideon Lockcatch," he said simply. He pulled a phone from his pocket, an exact match to the one she had been texting, and placed it on the coffee table. "You type very fast under pressure." Harper stared at the phone. She looked up at him. Gideon Lockcatch didn't look like a savior. He looked like an executioner. Gideon turned his attention to Tyler, who was turning purple against the wall, pinned by the larger man, Samson. Gideon said quietly, "Put him down. Let him breathe." Samson dropped Tyler. Tyler hit the floor, gasping and coughing, clutching his throat. He looked up at Gideon, terror in his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Tyler croaked, trying to push himself backward. "You can't just break in here. I'll call the cops." Gideon crouched down, bringing himself to Tyler's eye level. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man examining a very uninteresting bug. "Tyler," Gideon said. "You broke her leg." "It was an accident." Tyler squeaked, backing into the corner. "She tripped. We were just arguing and she tripped." Gideon sighed softly. He reached out and grasped Tyler's right hand. Tyler flinched, but didn't pull away, too terrified to move. Gideon inspected Tyler's bruised knuckles. "You strike me as a man who lies very often and very poorly," Gideon said. Before Tyler could process the words, Gideon twisted Tyler's wrist. It wasn't a fast, brutal snap. It was a slow, careful application of pressure. Tyler shrieked as the bones in his wrist separated, a sickening popping sound echoing in the small room. Gideon let go, standing up and wiping his hand with a cloth handkerchief he pulled from his pocket. Tyler was rolling on the floor, cradling his ruined wrist, sobbing hysterically. "An accident," Gideon murmured. Just like that, he turned back to Harper. She was pressing herself into the floorboards, terrified. She had traded a home abuser for a monster. Gideon saw the fear in her eyes. His expression didn't soften, but he crouched down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I am not going to hurt you." He stated a simple declaration of fact. "My medical team is in the hallway. They are going to brace your leg and carry you out of here. It will hurt. But you are leaving this apartment and you are never coming back." Harper looked at him, her chest heaving. "Why?" She managed to whisper. "I don't even know you." "A happy accident." Gideon replied, his dark eyes finally locking onto hers. "I hate men who hit women, and I had a free evening." The man who entered next carried a black medical bag. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He moved with the same quiet efficiency as Samson and Gideon. "This is Dr. Miller," Gideon said, stepping back to give the man room. "He is discreet. Do exactly as he says." Dr. Miller knelt beside Harper. He didn't offer a false smile. He just opened his bag and pulled out a pair of heavy shears. "I need to cut the denim, Harper," Miller said, his voice brisk and professional. "This is going to sting." He sliced through the fabric of her jeans, peeling it back to expose the swelling purple flesh of her shin. Harper hissed through her teeth, her fingers digging into the floorboards. The skin was tight and shiny, the bone pressing dangerously close to the surface. "Clean break, but the shift is severe," Miller muttered, glancing up at Gideon. "She needs an operation. I can stabilize it for transport, but we need to move her now." Gideon nodded once. He turned his attention back to the corner of the room. Tyler was whimpering, curled into a fetal position, clutching his broken wrist. The false bravado was entirely gone. He was a puddle of pathetic, terrified sweat. Gideon walked over and stood above him. He didn't kick him. He didn't yell. The silence he commanded was far more heavy. "Tyler," Gideon said. Tyler squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. "Please, I didn't mean it. Please don't kill me." "I am not going to kill you," Gideon replied. The relief that washed over Tyler's face was instant, but it died just as quickly when Gideon continued. "Death is a release. You don't get a release, you get consequences." Gideon looked at Samson, who was standing by the ruined door. "Take him to the warehouse. Call Elias. Tell him I have a project for him. A man who needs to learn how to walk without working kneecaps." Tyler screamed. It was a high, thin sound of absolute panic. "No, you can't do this. You're crazy." Samson grabbed Tyler by the scruff of his neck, hauling him up. Tyler thrashed, kicking his legs, but Samson dragged him out the door with zero effort, ignoring his pleas. The sound of Tyler's screams faded down the stairwell, eventually silenced by the heavy thud of the building's front door. Harper watched it happen through a blur of pain. Her mind was misfiring, trying to process the casual setup of violence. "Hold her down," Miller instructed. Harper snapped her attention back to the doctor. He was holding a traction brace. "I have to align the bone before we put her on the stretcher," Miller warned Gideon. "She's going to fight it." Gideon stepped forward. He crouched beside Harper's head. He didn't touch her face or offer a hand to hold. He simply placed his heavy hands flat on her shoulders, pinning her to the floor. "Breathe in," Gideon commanded. Harper drew a breath. Miller pulled the leg. Harper didn't just scream. Her vision went white entirely. The pain was a physical thing, a monstrous thing tearing through her nervous system. She arched off the floor, but Gideon's hands were unyielding anchors holding her down. A wild sound ripped from her throat until she literally ran out of air. As quickly as it happened, it stopped. The bone slid back into a rough alignment, the blinding pain settling into a dull, throbbing roar. Harper gasped, tears streaming down her temples, mixing with the dust on the floor. She was shaking uncontrollably. "Done," Miller said, quickly securing the brace. "Let's get the board." Two more men appeared from the hallway carrying a rigid transport board. They worked quickly, securing Harper with heavy straps. She felt detached from her own body. She was floating above the room, watching these men in expensive suits carry her out of her own apartment. As they lifted her, she looked at Gideon. He was watching her intently. "Where are you taking me?" She slurred, the shock finally shutting down her thinking. "Somewhere safe," Gideon said, falling into step beside the stretcher as they carried her down the narrow, dimly lit stairs. "I don't have money," Harper whispered, her eyes heavy. "For the doctor, for the help, I can't pay you." The stretcher was loaded into the back of a massive black SUV, idling in the alleyway. The interior smelled of expensive leather and antiseptic. Dr. Miller climbed in beside her, immediately hooking an 4-line into her arm. Gideon stood by the open back doors of the vehicle. The street lights caught the sharp angles of his face. He looked at her entirely unreadable. "I don't want your money, Harper," Gideon said quietly. "Then what do you want?" The morphine from Miller's 4 hit her bloodstream. A cold rush that began dragging her down into the dark. But before her eyes fluttered shut, she heard Gideon's answer. A low promise over the rumble of the engine. "I want to see what happens when you finally stop bleeding on the floor." He shut the doors. Waking up was not a smooth flutter of eyelashes. It was a slow, hard crawl through a thick swamp of drugs. First came the sound, a rhythmic, quiet beep. It didn't belong in her apartment. Her apartment sounded like traffic on the wet asphalt and the rattle of a failing AC window unit. This sound was clean, steady. Then came the smell. Bleach, expensive floral detergent, the sharp tang of iodine. Harper tried to swallow, but her throat was sandpaper. She forced her eyes open. The light was muted, filtering through heavy charcoal gray blackout curtains that covered a massive window. She was staring at a ceiling painted in a soft matte white. There were no water stains, no cracks. She turned her head. It felt like moving a boulder. She was in a bed, a hospital bed, but framed in rich wood rather than cold metal. And 4 lines snaked from the back of her left hand up to a saline bag hanging from a chrome stand. To her right, a vitals monitor blinked softly. Memory rushed back in a violent disorienting flood. The linoleum floor, Tyler's boots, the splintering door, Gideon Locke's empty eyes, the snap of Tyler's wrist, the traction brace. Harper gasped, her hands flying down to her right leg. She couldn't feel it. Panic, sharp and icy, spiked in her chest. She threw off the thick duvet. Her right leg, from mid-thigh down to her toes, was encased in a heavy fiberglass cast. There was a thick surgical dressing peeking out from the top. "You have a titanium rod in your lower leg bone," a voice said. Harper flinched, snapping her head towards the corner of the room. Dr. Miller sat in a leather armchair under a soft reading lamp. He was reading a thick medical journal, his glasses pushed down his nose. He didn't look like a man who had taken part in a home invasion. He looked like a bored suburban doctor. He closed the journal and stood up, walking over to the bed. He checked the 4-line, tapping the plastic tubing with a manicured fingernail. "The surgery took 4 hours." Miller stated, his tone entirely casual. "Your boyfriend did a remarkable job crushing the bone. A simple cast wouldn't hold it. I had to use plates and screws to rebuild the structure before inserting the rod." Harper stared at him. The clinical terms washed over her, meaningless against the sheer terror of her situation. "Where am I?" she managed to croak. "You are a guest of Mr. Locke." "That doesn't answer my question." Miller offered a thin, humorless smile. "Geographically, you are 50 miles outside the city limits. Practically, you are in a secure medical wing of a private residence. You are safe. You are heavily medicated. And you are not to pull at that 4. I want to leave." "No, you don't." The voice came from the doorway. Harper looked past Dr. Miller. Gideon stood there. He had changed out of the charcoal suit and was now wearing dark slacks and a black soft sweater with the sleeves pushed up. Without the suit jacket, he looked broader, more dangerous. He walked into the room. Miller immediately stepped back, giving the space to him. "Doctor," Gideon said quietly. "Give us the room." Miller nodded once and walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. It latched with a solid, clear click. Harper shrank back against the pillows. She felt incredibly small, swallowed by the massive bed, trapped by the heavy cast. Gideon didn't approach the bed. He took the armchair Miller had left. He crossed his legs, resting his elbows on the armrests, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. He watched her. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Harper refused to look away, though holding his gaze felt like staring into a vacuum. "You are waiting for the other shoe to drop," Gideon finally said. Usually when men break down my door and take me, there's a catch. Harper replied. Her voice was raspy, but the sarcasm was real. It was her only defense left. You were not taken. You were pulled out. A polite word for abduction, a factual word for removing a victim from a deadly environment. Gideon corrected. He didn't raise his voice. He just stated the words as if they were gravity. Inarguable. Tyler was going to kill you, Harper. If not last night, then next week, next month. He broke your leg because you were leaving him. Correct? Harper swallowed hard. She looked down at the stark white sheets. I was packing a bag. He caught me. He caught you because you hesitated. Gideon said. You waited until he was at work, but you took too long organizing your things. You wanted to leave, but you were still afraid of making a mess. Her head snapped up. How do you know that? Because it is the pattern of the abused. Gideon replied smoothly. You try to lessen the damage even while you are fleeing. You try to fold the clothes neatly before you run out the door. It is a fatal flaw. Harper felt a hot flush of anger burn through the drug haze. Who the hell do you think you are to analyze me? You break into my apartment, torture my boyfriend, drag me here, and put metal in my leg without my consent. Consent? Gideon cut her off. The word was sharp, cracking like a whip in the quiet room. You texted a stranger, begging for help. You provided your address. I provided the medical help you needed to keep your leg. If I had left you there, the bone would have died. You would have lost the limb from the knee down, or Tyler would have panicked when the swelling cut off your circulation, and he would have strangled you to keep you quiet. He leaned forward slightly. The movement was predatory. I did not ask for your permission to save your life, Harper, because you were in no position to grant it. Harper glared at him, her chest heaving. She wanted to yell. She wanted to throw something at his perfectly composed face. But the fire went out as quickly as it sparked. She was exhausted. She was broken. And she knew with terrifying certainty that he was absolutely right. What happened to him? She whispered. Gideon held her gaze. Tyler is no longer a concern of yours. Did you kill him? I don't waste bullets on home cowards, Gideon said. He is currently residing in a basement in the industrial district. He has 2 shattered kneecaps. Samson is ensuring he receives the exact level of medical care he offered you, which is to say none. Harper felt a sickening jolt in her stomach. It was a mix of absolute horror and a dark, twisted sense of justice. She hated herself for the latter. You're a monster, she breathed. Gideon didn't flinch. He just stood up, smoothing the front of his sweater. Monsters hide under the bed, Harper. I stand right in front of you. He walked toward the door. Miller will be back with your antibiotics in 2 hours. Tomorrow, we start making you useful. The next 3 days were a masterclass in controlled pain. The morphine was tapered off, replaced by lesser painkillers that did absolutely nothing to dull the deep, grinding ache in Harper's shin. The titanium rod felt like a block of ice buried deep inside her bone. She learned the layout of her cage. It was a massive suite. She had a private bathroom equipped with a walk-in shower and grab bars. The closet was stocked with soft neutral-colored loungewear that fit her perfectly. There were no locks on the inside of the doors, but she quickly discovered there were none on the outside either. On the 4th day, Dr. Miller arrived with a set of aluminum crutches. Up, Miller ordered, tossing the crutches onto the bed. Harper stared at them. I can barely sit up without passing out. Mr. Locke has requested your presence in the dining room for lunch. I suggest you figure it out. Miller checked his watch. You have 20 minutes. He left. Harper sat on the edge of the bed. Her right leg hung heavily, the cast pulling at her hip joint. She was sweating just from the effort of sitting upright. She looked at the crutches. I want to see what happens when you finally stop bleeding on the floor. Gideon's words echoed in her skull. It wasn't a threat. It was a challenge. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed the crutches. Getting them positioned under her arms was a clumsy, humiliating process. The moment she put weight on her good leg and hoisted herself up, the blood rushed downward into her broken leg. The pressure against the surgical cuts was blinding. She bit back a scream, swaying violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sickness to pass. One step then another. By the time she reached the heavy oak door, her hospital gown was clinging to her sweat slicked back. She opened the door. A man in a dark suit was standing in the hallway. He wasn't Samson. He was younger with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked at her entirely unimpressed and gestured down the corridor. Follow the hall to the stairs. There is an elevator to your left. He said flatly. Harper didn't reply. She just started walking. The estate was massive. A sprawling brutal structure of exposed concrete, dark wood, and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked a dense pine forest. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress designed by someone who hated sunlight. She found the dining room. It was a large room dominated by a long live-edge walnut table. Gideon sat at the far end. A laptop was open in front of him and he was typing rapidly. He didn't look up as she swung herself into the room, her crutches thudding against the hardwood floor. Sit, he said. Harper navigated to the nearest chair and collapsed into it. She let the crutches clatter to the floor. She was gasping for air, her leg throbbing in time with her racing heart. A woman in a quiet gray uniform immediately stepped out from a side door, placing a plate of roasted chicken and vegetables in front of Harper along with a glass of water. She vanished just as quickly. Gideon closed the laptop. He looked at her flushed face, the sweat on her brow. You took 24 minutes, Gideon noted. Go to hell, Harper snapped, grabbing the glass of water and downing half of it in one gulp. Gideon's mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on him, and it was entirely devoid of warmth. Your spirit is returning. Good, eat. Harper picked up a fork. She was ravenous. The hospital food Miller had been feeding her was bland and basic. This tasted incredible. She ate in silence for a few minutes before the reality of the situation forced her to speak. Why am I here? She asked, her mouth half full. And don't give me that saving you garbage. Men like you don't do charity. Gideon cut a piece of steak on his own plate. His movements were precise, surgical. Men like me, he repeated, tasting the phrase. And what kind of man am I, Harper? A criminal, she said bluntly. You have armed guards. You kidnapped a man. You operate a black market hospital wing. You're a mob boss or a cartel leader. I don't know the exact flavor of your cold nature, but you aren't a good Samaritan. Gideon chewed, swallowed, and dabbed his mouth with a napkin. I am a businessman, he corrected. My business operates outside the view of local law enforcement because local law enforcement is inefficient and prone to bribery. I provide order by breaking people's wrists and kneecaps. By enforcing consequences, he counted smoothly. In my world, there is a ledger. Every action incurs a debt or a credit. Tyler accrued a massive debt by laying his hands on you. I collected. And what about me? Harper put her fork down. Her appetite suddenly vanished. What is my debt? Gideon stared at her. His dark eyes locked onto hers, pinning her to the chair. You owe me a great deal, he said quietly. I financed your surgery. I am providing your housing, your security, and your rehabilitation. In the real world, you would be ruined financially. Here, you are merely in the red. Harper felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. I told you, I don't have money. I have enough money to burn this city to the ground and build a new one on the ashes. Gideon said dismissively. I don't want your cash. Then what do you want? Loyalty. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I employ many people. Gideon continued, leaning back in his chair. Soldiers, smugglers, accountants, but I have very few people I can trust to remain invisible. You are a ghost, Harper. You have no family tying you down, save for a sister you rarely speak to. You worked as a data entry clerk for a logistics firm. You are meticulous. You are observant. And right now, you are a blank slate. Harper's mind raced. He had done a background check on her. He knew about Suddy. He knew about her job. You want me to work for you? I want you to manage my ledgers. Gideon corrected. The real ones. The ones my accountants never see. The ones that track the movement of illegal goods, the payoffs, the bribes. You will catalog the rot of this city for me. And if I say no, Gideon didn't blink. You are free to leave. Samson will drive you to the city limits and drop you off with a broken leg, no job, and a hospital bill you cannot afford. And you will eventually run into Tyler's friends who are currently looking for the woman they believe set him up. It wasn't a choice. It was an ultimatum wrapped in velvet. You're trapping me, Harper whispered. I am giving you a job, Gideon stated. A very well-paying one. You will live here. You will heal. You will work. And when your debt is paid, which will take precisely 3 years at the salary I am offering, you may leave with enough capital to disappear anywhere in the world. 3 years. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like a prison sentence. But as she looked at the heavy fiberglass cast on her leg and thought about the linoleum floor of her apartment, she knew the truth. Gideon Lockcatch wasn't a savior, but he was offering her the one thing Tyler had systematically destroyed. Leverage. Harper picked up her fork. She looked Gideon dead in the eye. I want a laptop, she said, her voice steady. And I want physical therapy every single day. If I'm working for you, I'm not doing it from a bed. Gideon watched her for a long moment. He nodded once. Deal. Recovery was not a straight line. It was a jagged, brutal, sawtooth graph of small victories and crushing defeats. The first month was entirely physical. Gideon brought in a physiotherapist named Maggie. She was a stout, no-nonsense woman with forearms like a dock worker and a bedside manner that bordered on aggressive. The bone is knitting, Maggie said on a rainy Tuesday, aggressively kneading the wasted muscles of Harper's right thigh above the cast. But the muscle is turning to jelly. If you don't fire these nerves, you're going to walk with a limp for the rest of your life. Harper gritted her teeth, staring at the ceiling of the private gym Gideon had assigned to her. Sweat pooled in her collarbones. It hurts. Pain is a neurological suggestion. Maggie grunted, pushing her thumb brutally into a trigger point. Ignore it. Fire the quad now. Harper tried. She sent the signal from her brain to her leg. The muscle twitched, followed immediately by a sharp, stabbing pain near the titanium screws in her shin. She gasped, her head falling back against the mat. Again, Maggie ordered. I can't. You can. You just don't want to. I said I can't, Harper yelled, her voice echoing off the mirrored walls of the gym. Tears of sheer frustration pricked her eyes. She hated being weak. She hated that her body felt like a fragile alien thing. She said she can't, Maggie. Harper froze. She craned her neck backward. Gideon was standing in the doorway of the gym. He wore a tailored navy suit today, a stark contrast to the sweatpants and tank top Harper was wearing. He walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the rubber matting. Maggie immediately stepped back, wiping her hands on a towel. Mr. Locke, she's plateauing. She refuses to push past the threshold. Gideon looked down at Harper. She wiped furiously at her eyes, hating that he was seeing her cry. She wasn't crying from fear. She was crying from absolute rage at her own limitations. "Get up," Gideon said. Harper stared at him. "What?" "Get up, Harper. Walk to the door." "I can't put weight on it yet." She snapped. Dr. Miller said, "Dr. Miller is a surgeon. He builds the scaffolding. Maggie builds the muscle. I build the intent." Gideon interrupted. He walked over to the crutches, leaning against the wall, and kicked them out into the hallway. They clattered noisily against the hardwood. Harper's eyes widened. "What are you doing? You have been here for 5 weeks." Gideon said, turning back to her. His voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. "You are managing my digital ledgers perfectly. You are organized. You are ruthless with the numbers, but physically you are still acting like a victim, waiting for the next blow. I have a titanium rod in my leg." She screamed at him, "Which makes the leg stronger than it was before." He shot back, stepping closer. He loomed over her, a dark shadow blocking out the overhead lights. "The rod will not break. The bone will not snap. The only thing stopping you is the memory of the floor in that cheap apartment." Harper breathed heavily. Her chest heaved. The sheer audacity of this man standing in his expensive suit lecturing her about pain. "You don't know anything about it," she hissed. "I know that Tyler broke your leg because you let him get close enough to do it," Gideon said brutally. The words were a physical slap. "You surrendered your space. You surrendered your agency. And you are doing it right now on this mat. You are waiting for Maggie to fix you. You are waiting for me to allow you to stop." He leaned down, grabbing her by the left arm, and yanked her violently upright. Harper shrieked, hopping wildly on her good leg to keep her balance. The heavy cast on her right leg swung awkwardly. She grabbed Gideon's lapels to keep from falling. The fabric of his suit was incredibly soft beneath her white-knuckled grip. He didn't pull away. He stood perfectly still, letting her use him as a crutch. His chest was solid, unyielding stone beneath her hands. "Let go of me," she choked out, her face inches from his. She could smell his cologne, cedar, and cold ozone. "No," he said. "Stand on it. It will tear the cuts. The cuts are healed. The bone is set. Put your foot on the ground, Harper." She stared up into his hollow, dark eyes. There was no malice in them, just an absolute terrifying certainty. He wasn't going to let her fall, but he wasn't going to carry her either. Trembling, she lowered her right leg. The heavy rubber sole of the walking cast touched the rubber matting. "Wait," Gideon commanded. Harper shifted an inch of her body weight onto the right leg. A dull, protesting ache radiated up her shin, wrapping around her knee. She whimpered, instinctively trying to pull the leg back up. Gideon's hands shot out, wrapping around her waist. His grip was iron. He held her firmly in place. "Do not retreat," he whispered, his voice suddenly dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You never retreat again. Push through the floor." She closed her eyes. She focused on the anger. The anger at Tyler. The anger at her own helplessness. The anger at Gideon for forcing her into this crucible. She funneled all of it downward. She pressed her foot firmly onto the floor. The pain flared bright and hot. A warning siren in her brain. But beneath the pain, there was something else. Resistance. The titanium rod held. The bone held. She was standing. She opened her eyes. She was still gripping Gideon's lapels, but her weight was evenly distributed. She was breathing heavily, sweat stinging her eyes, but she wasn't falling. Gideon looked down at her. His hands slowly released her waist, stepping back a single inch. Just enough to let her stand entirely on her own. The pain is just information, Gideon said quietly. It tells you where the boundaries are. It is up to you to push them outward. He turned and walked towards the door. He stopped at the threshold, glancing back over his shoulder. Your numbers on the west side docks were off by a margin of 3%, he added, his tone snapping instantly back to business. Find the discrepancy before dinner, or I will deduct the missing capital from your salary. He walked out, leaving her standing alone in the center of the gym. Harper stood there for a long moment, the ache in her leg throbbing in time with her pulse. She looked at Maggie, who was watching her with a quiet, approving smirk. Harper wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the door Gideon had just walked through. Maggie, Harper said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the tremble of fear. Yeah, show me how to fire the quad again. The cast came off in November. It was replaced by a sleek black carbon fiber cane. Harper hated it. She hated the sharp click it made against the hardwood floors of the estate, a constant reminder of her deficit. But she used it. She walked the perimeter of her gilded cage. She walked the long hallways and she walked into Gideon's office. It was a Tuesday evening, rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind his heavy oak desk. Gideon was on the phone, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He held up a single finger as Harper entered. She didn't wait by the door. She crossed the room, the cane clicking rhythmically, and dropped a leather-bound folder onto the center of his desk. Gideon finished the call, hanging up the receiver without breaking eye contact with her. I found your 3%, Harper said flatly. She opened the folder, spinning it around so the spreadsheet faced him. She tapped a column of numbers with a manicured fingernail. The West Side docks operate on a cash-heavy rotation. Your manifest shows incoming shipping containers billed at a standard tariff, Harper explained, her voice devoid of hesitation. But the fuel surcharge is fluctuating. It shouldn't. Fuel prices have been static for 6 months. Someone is padding the fuel invoices by 3% and skimming the difference before it reaches the central account. Gideon looked at the spreadsheet. He traced the line of numbers. Who? Your logistics manager, Mitchell. Gideon closed the folder. He leaned back in his leather chair. He didn't look angry. He looked intrigued. You are certain. Numbers do not lie, Gideon. People do. It was the first time she had used his first name without a sneer. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate. The air thickened. Gideon hit a button on his intercom. Samson, bring Mitchell to the study. You're going to break his legs. Harper stated. It wasn't a question. Embezzlement is a breach of contract. Gideon replied evenly. I provide a lucrative wage in exchange for absolute loyalty. Mitchell broke the terms he took from the collective. So you maim him. I reset the ledger. Gideon corrected. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. You can leave now. The administrative part of this transaction is over. Harper gripped the handle of her cane. Her knuckles turned white. 3 months ago, she would have fled to her room, pressing her hands over her ears to block out the sounds of violence. She would have hid. No, Harper said. Gideon paused. He looked at her, his head tilted a fraction of an inch. No, I found the error. I built the case, she said, her voice remarkably steady. I want to see the audit. Gideon stared at her for a long, silent moment. The hollow look in his eyes. Receded, replaced by something entirely different. It looked a lot like respect. Very well. 10 minutes later, Mitchell was dragged into the room. He was a weaselly man in a cheap suit, sweating profusely. Samson threw him to the floor. Mitchell scrambled to his knees, his eyes darting frantically between Samson and Gideon. Then he noticed Harper standing quietly by the bookshelf, leaning on a cane. Mr. Locke, I swear I don't know why I'm here. Mitchell stammered. Gideon walked around his desk. He picked up the leather folder Harper had prepared and dropped it onto the floor in front of Mitchell. The heavy thud made the man flinch. "Fuel, sir, charges, Mitchell," Gideon said quietly. 3% over 6 months. It amounts to $80,000. Mitchell's face drained of color. It was a clerical error. The software is infallible because Miss Harper manages it. Gideon interrupted, his voice dropping to his terrifying whisper. "She doesn't make errors." "You do." Gideon looked at Samson and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Samson stepped forward. He didn't pull a weapon. He just grabbed Mitchell's right hand and slammed it flat onto the heavy oak desk. Mitchell began to scream before Samson even raised the heavy solid brass paperweight. The sickening crunch of bone breaking echoed in the study. Mitchell collapsed, shrieking in agony, cradling his mangled hand against his chest. Harper didn't look away, her heart hammered against her ribs, bile rising in her throat. But she forced her eyes to stay open. She watched Mitchell writhe. She watched the consequence. It was brutal. It was primitive, and it was perfectly balanced. Gideon stepped over Mitchell, stopping directly in front of Harper. He searched her face, looking for the terrified girl he had scraped off a linoleum floor. She wasn't there anymore. "Does the math satisfy you?" Gideon asked quietly over Mitchell's sobbing. Harper looked down at the embezzler, then back up to the man who commanded the violence. "The ledger is closed," she said. A year changed the architecture of Harper's survival. The cane was relegated to the back of her closet, used only on damp mornings when the titanium rod ached deep in the marrow. She wore tailored trousers and silk blouses, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She was no longer just the girl in the guest room. She was the central nervous system of Gideon's empire. She controlled the flow of capital. She dictated the laundering protocols. When the lieutenants came to the estate for meetings, they didn't look at her with pity. They looked at her with weariness. Because Harper knew precisely how much they were worth, and how quickly they could be zeroed out. Gideon rarely touched her. Their intimacy was not built on physical affection. It was built on a terrifying symbiotic trust. They spent hours in the study late at night, dissecting territory maps and financial reports, fueled by black coffee and the quiet hum of shared ambition until the night the perimeter fell. It was 2 a.m. Harper was in her suite reviewing a wire transfer from a shell company in the Caymans when the power grid died. The estate plunged into total darkness. Harper froze. The quiet hum of the HVAC system stopped. A second later, the backup generators kicked in, bathing the hallways in a sickly red emergency light. Then came the gunfire. It was distant at first, a sharp staccato popping down by the main gate, but it rapidly escalated into a deafening roar echoing through the valley. This wasn't a warning. It was an assault. Harper didn't panic. Panic was for victims. She shoved away from her desk, grabbed the heavy Glock 19 Gideon had insisted she learn to shoot, and moved into the hallway. The air smelled of ozone and cordite. Men were shouting downstairs. She recognized Samson's deep bellow, followed immediately by the shattering of the massive glass windows in the foyer. Harper. Gideon materialized from the shadows near the stairwell. He wore black tactical gear over his clothes, a suppressed rifle strapped to his chest. His eyes were wide, the calm veneer completely shattered. "Rival syndicate," Gideon said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the opposite end of the hall. "The Colombians, they bought off the local police precinct. We are entirely on our own. We need to reach the bunker." "What about the ledger?" Harper demanded, her mind instantly going to the physical hard drives in the study. "If they get the drives, forget the drives. I need you breathing." He snarled, shoving her ahead of him. They reached the end of the corridor. A heavy steel door led to the private elevator that descended into the reinforced basement. Gideon punched a code into the keypad. The light blinked green. Before the door could open, the stairwell door behind them burst off its hinges. 3 men in tactical gear spilled into the corridor, raising automatic weapons. Down! Gideon roared, tackling Harper to the floor. The air above them exploded in a hail of bullets, shredding the drywall and shattering the light fixtures. Gideon rolled, bringing his rifle up and fired 3 suppressed, precise shots. 2 of the men dropped instantly, their body armor useless against armor-piercing rounds. The 3rd man dove behind a marble pillar, returning fire blindly. Harper pressed her face into the carpet, the ringing in her ears absolute agony. She heard a sharp wet thud, followed by Gideon's sharp intake of breath. The return fire stopped. Samson had flanked the 3rd man from the stairwell. A single shot ended the immediate threat. Harper scrambled to her feet, her right leg screaming in protest at the sudden violence. She looked down. Gideon was on his knees leaning heavily against the wall. A dark spreading stain ruined the black fabric of his tactical vest just below the collarbone. He was breathing in shallow ragged gasps. Gideon! Harper choked, dropping beside him. She pressed her hands over the wound. The blood was hot and thick, spilling over her fingers. Elevator! He grunted, his head lolling against the wall. He was losing blood too fast. The shock was setting in. Harper looked at the open elevator doors. It was 10 feet away. Gideon weighed over 200 pounds of dead weight. Samson! Harper screamed. Holding the stairs. Samson yelled back, the sound of fresh gunfire erupting from the floor below. Get him down. Harper grabbed Gideon by the straps of his vest. She hauled upward, screaming with the effort. Her right leg, the one Tyler had shattered, took the brunt of the burden. The titanium rod vibrated with the strain. The pain was blinding. A white-hot spike driving straight into her brain. The pain is just information. Get up, Harper hissed, her face inches from his. You do not get to die on my floor. Get up. She yanked him to his feet. Gideon leaned his entire bulk onto her left shoulder. She braced her right foot against the carpet, pushing off. Step, drag, step, drag. They stumbled into the elevator just as a new wave of men breached the hallway. Bullets sparked off the closing steel doors. Harper hit the basement button, her hand smeared with his blood. The elevator dropped. Gideon slid down the wall, coughing violently. Blood splattered against the stainless steel paneling. He looked up at her, his eyes losing focus. You didn't hesitate, he whispered, a weak, bloody smile ghosting across his face. You didn't fold the clothes. Shut up, she cried, tearing the silk scarf from her neck and pressing it into the bullet hole. Keep your eyes on me. Don't look away. The ledger, he mumbled, his head dropping back. I balanced the ledger, she said fiercely, pressing her forehead against his. And you owe me. You hear me? You are in the red, Gideon. You don't get to check out until the debt is paid. The elevator stopped. The doors opened into the cold, sterile sanctuary of the bunker. Harper dragged him into the light. 3 days later, the bunker smelled intensely of bleach and iron. Harper sat in a metal folding chair beside a medical cot. She hadn't slept for more than 40 minutes at a time. She wore the same blood-stained silk blouse, the fabric stiff and ruined. Dr. Miller had been in the bunker when the assault started. He had spent 4 hours digging a fragmented 5.56 round out of Gideon's chest cavity, millimeters from his subclavian artery. The estate above was quiet. The Colombians had been repelled by reinforcements called in by Samson. The cleanup was ongoing, a silent, methodical erasure of bodies and blood. On the cot, Gideon shifted. His breathing hitched, then steadied. Slowly he opened his eyes. The harsh fluorescent light of the bunker made him wince. He turned his head, finding Harper instantly. He didn't look like a mob boss right now. Stripped to the waist, covered in bandages, pale and sweating, he looked incredibly human. "You look terrible," Gideon rasped, his voice raw. Harper didn't smile, but the crushing weight on her chest finally fractured, letting in a single sliver of air. "You bled on my good shoes," she replied softly. She poured a cup of water from a plastic pitcher and held the straw to his lips. He drank greedily, leaning his head back against the thin pillow. He studied her face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the dried blood on her collar, the absolute rigidity of her posture. "My leg hurts," she said quietly, answering the question he hadn't asked. "I put too much weight on it, dragging you, but it didn't break." "Titanium," Gideon murmured. "Yes." Harper set the cup down. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, clasping her hands together. "Dr. Miller says, you need 6 weeks of rest. You tore muscle, and the blood loss was severe. You are confined to this bed and then a wheelchair." Gideon grimaced, attempting to sit up before the pain forced him back down with a sharp hiss. "The business is running." Harper interrupted smoothly. "Samson is managing the perimeter and the retaliation. I am managing the accounts. I rerouted the Cayman's transfer to a blind trust to secure the liquid assets while the house was compromised. The Colombians got nothing but bullets." Gideon stared at her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and profound. "You took control of the entire network," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. "Someone had to balance the ledger while you were unconscious." She replied, her tone perfectly even. Gideon reached out, his hand was trembling slightly, a rare physical weakness. He bypassed her hand and grasped her wrist, his thumb brushing against her pulse point. "The 3 years are up," he said quietly. Harper frowned. "I've been here 14 months. You saved my life. The debt is nullified," Gideon stated, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual commanding timbre. "Your account is clear, Harper. The severance package we discussed is in a secure account. You have enough capital to vanish. You don't have to live in a bunker. You don't have to watch men get their hands broken." He released her wrist. He let his arm fall back onto the bed. "You are free to leave." Harper looked at her wrist where his skin had burned against hers. She thought about the linoleum floor. She thought about Tyler's pathetic manufactured guilt. She thought about the small, terrified woman who had texted a wrong number, hoping for a savior to pull her out of the mud. That woman was dead. Gideon had burned her away, leaving only the metal behind. She stood up. The carbon fiber cane was resting against the wall. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need it today. Harper walked over to the small steel table at the end of the room and picked up a thick leather-bound folder. She walked back to the bed and dropped it directly onto Gideon's lap right over the white bandages. "The western ports are still short," Harper said, her voice dropping to a cool clinical register. "And Samson's ammunition expenditures from last night need to be categorized properly before the end of the quarter. We are bleeding cash on tactical gear." Gideon looked at the folder. He looked up at her. The hollow darkness in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable possession. "You aren't leaving," he stated. "No." Harper agreed. She leaned down, resting her hands on either side of his shoulders, bringing her face inches from his. She could smell the iodine in his skin. "I built this architecture. I own the numbers. And I don't surrender my space to anyone anymore. Not even you." Gideon's jaw tightened. A dark, genuine smile finally broke across his face. He reached up, his hand tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck, pulling her down the final inch until their lips brushed. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of gravity, a sealing of a violent, unbreakable contract. "Good," he breathed against her mouth. "Because I was never going to let you walk out that door anyway." Harper pulled back, smoothing the front of her ruined silk blouse. "I know," she said, pulling the metal folding chair closer and sitting back down. "Now look at page 4. We have a problem in the warehouse district." That's a wrap on Harper and Gideon's story. From bleeding on a linoleum floor to commanding an entire underground empire, Harper proved that sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to become the one who controls it. She didn't just pay her debt, she rewrote the entire ledger. Did you expect her to stay and take the throne beside him? If this story kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe for more.